Published in 1971 on April 1st, the Young Lords newspaper on Latin liberation in Lincoln Park published its first issue outlining the tumultuous and difficult expression of race relations and the confrontation of oppression within the Puerto Rican American community. The Young Lords organization was one founded in 1968 in Harlem, New York, where a financially corrupt neighborhood of Puerto Rican Americans and Hispanic communities alike founded a coalition dedicated to the release of political prisoners, the removal of troops from Vietnam and Puerto Rico, and the earned equality of healthcare and human rights that had been stripped from the community. Their first significant demonstration occurred when several dozen protesters within the Young Lords protested the trash-ridden streets of East Harlem by allocating garbage and burning it in the street, halting traffic and alerting authorities. This was called the Garbage Offensive of 1970. The Young Lords gained press quickly, and other Puerto Rican Americans became invested with the search for Latino equality within their communities. The neighborhood of Lincoln Park in Chicago, Illinois was a heavily populated Puerto Rican American community. From being predominantly a working-class Latin community in the 1970s, we can acknowledge a downscale in Latin population in this neighborhood. The statistical atlas telling us that there is a 6.3 Hispanic population in Lincoln Park, compared to a near 30% in the city of Chicago. The Young Lords migrated to cities further west, where cities like Chicago were able to distribute news and information about Latin liberation to heavily populated Latin neighborhoods, for example, the neighborhoods of Brighton Park and Belmont. Jose Chacha Jimenez implemented the Young Lords organization out of Lincoln Park in response to Mayor Richard J. Daley's plan for urban renewal.
So that if it does not respond to, Puerto Ricans' needs, the Young Lords must begin to open up that space.
I do think that there is a great need in the barrio. There's great injustice. There's terrible housing. There are things that have gone on far too long. And I really can't blame too many people for being angry. I get angry myself sometimes.
These were American efforts to recolonize major cities. It didn't fall through the cracks, as Jimenez directly fought against the bankers, real estate agents, and mortgage fund managers that were redlining and were in favor of what Jimenez called the urban removal. However, the power had surpassed him in his young organization, and Latin Americans in Chicago were shoved into the neighborhoods of Lakeview, Wicker Park, and Humboldt Park. The Young Lords organization gained traction through canvassing, nonviolent intervention, and protesting that they designed to be seen as mass education of the Latin liberation movement. By the end of 1970, the Young Lords organization in Chicago had nearly 100 members, including Felipe Luciano, a poet and writer for the Lincoln Park newspaper collection for the organization. Another formative member of the Chicago Coalition was Angela Lind Adorno, a feminist radicalist who met with Vietnamese families to evaluate and fight for immigrant rights. She was the first woman in the Young Lords organization of Lincoln Park to have a designated role in research of her community, as well as the others they were trying to protect. A common parallel between the Young Lords is drawn to the Black Panthers, a black organized militant group that fought in a similar sentiment to the Young Lords organization. The Black Panthers had a 10-point program that served as a valuable description of their motivation and efforts in cleaning up, remodeling, and fighting the oppressive systems that had held back the progress of the black community in America. Following a similar notion, the Young Lords organization developed a 13-point system that was revised and finalized by the New York Coalition by the end of 1970. Their demands, as a group, quoted as "we," were the following. 1. We want self-determination for Puerto Ricans, liberation on the island and inside the United States. During the Vietnam War, Puerto Rico was nothing more than a rest stop for the American community, often where prisoners would be dropped off or stranded. Communities had fallen apart from an economic standpoint, as drafted Puerto Rican soldiers would not be compensated or managed like their white counterparts. 2. We want self-determination for all Latinos. 3. We want liberation for all Third World people. 4. We are revolutionary nationalists that oppose racism. 5. We demand women's equality and rejection of the male chauvinist culture. The concept of machismo in Latin culture was prevalent but heavily rejected by left-of-center organizations like the Young Lords. The necessity to be a man should never be at the expense of women, said Denise Oliver Velez. 6. We want community control of land and institutions. 7. We demand education of the Afro-Indio and Latin culture. The demands for a logical education on economic and societal genocide of the Latin culture were one of the most ignored demands of the point system. It was believed that revolutionary culture had completely run over the young lords, overlooking their progress in cities like Dallas, New York, Chicago, Los Angeles. The young lords wanted justice against the historical offenses from the Spaniards to their community, and then, in a more modern context, the Yankees, which the young lords spelled as Yanquis. 8. We oppose the American military. American, spelled AMERIKKKAN. This was done as a strategic move by the young lords to emphasize the ability of white people to progress forward off the backs of slave labor and white supremacy. 9. We want freedom for all political prisoners. 10. We oppose capitalists and traders with allies. 11. We fight anti-communism with international unity. 12. We believe armed self-defense and armed struggle are the only means to liberation. 13. We want a socialist society. At its core, the Young Lords were a socialist, anti-Marxist, anti-fascist organization. Their dedication to social justice, representation of equal rights, and fighting the oppression of Latin Americans placed them in a vulnerable space as being seen as radical or militant, similar to the Black Panthers, therefore making them obvious targets for criticism and demotion of social progress.
To show that Puerto Ricans love America, but that ain't reality.
Police attack was planned beforehand. Only white cops were assigned.
Then our only recourse is to defend ourselves.
The Young Lords began to decline in the mid-1970s and officially dissolved in 1983 as some reparations were passed for Latin Americans in Chicago and assisting cities. This was a huge feat for Latin Americans in the recognition of human rights violations that had plagued the community and held back the most vulnerable members. The Young Lords newspaper collection expresses these issues and the history in a broader sense, giving specific anecdotes about incidents of police brutality, their first issue ever published following the illegal breaking and entering and concurrent shooting of Mother Berta Rodriguez in Dallas in 1970. The paper read in bold letters, "Basta ya," or "Enough," at the foot of the story. The consistent marginalization of Puerto Ricans in Chicago didn't go unnoticed, as similar stories were covered and filtered through the Lincoln Park publication, where writers would use strong language to impose their belief of the system, calling all police pigs, and calling all real estate agents that removed them from their homes thieves. This 25-cent newspaper also took in inquiries from their Chicago audience, one volume including an excerpt from a student at DePaul University highlighting a recent coalition effort between the Black Student Union and the Young Lords, who paired together in the dozens to fight against a presumed oppressive admission system in the predominantly white university. This was published in October 1969. The ability to provide press to a community greater than yourself is something that the Young Lords tackled in full. With the further opening of health clinics, organized political campaigns, and a greater unity between Puerto Rican Americans in their city, it was a huge step forward in terms of not just making their livelihood known, but making their livelihood progressive. The Washington Post provided data in a study from June of this year to reveal that the Hispanic population of the United States, which is only 12% of the whole, has a share of 33% of all fatal police shootings since 2015. This disproportionate amount is astounding, and an allusion to the progress the Young Lords were seeking for. It lends to the question if their goal was ever reached, if their message was ever heard, and whether or not they can say that their voices were truly uplifted. The Young Lords newspaper was one that was not held back. It was loud and unsilenceable, bringing issues to the forefront that no power above them could remove. In the 7th edition of the second volume of the newspaper, we see a story covered that was beyond silent, the disappearance of Chairman Chacha Jimenez. Omar Lopez writes in the paper that Jimenez disappeared a day before being taken to jail for a 1-year sentence without bail. Jimenez was someone who was strict in his power, Lopez wrote, so the young lord stood proud with Jimenez and placed the fault of his disappearance and alleged death on the Chicago Police Department, a case that was consistently written about in the paper over the next 3 issues. There's a conversation to be had today about Latin liberation. We can draw similarities between the unfair treatment of Latin American people in many different contexts. The high mortality rate for Hispanic women in urban cities hasn't been lowered in nearly a decade. The median income for a Hispanic household in the United States is nearly $20,000 less than a white household, as reported by the U.S. Census. The ICE detention centers at the southern borders of the U.S. have surpassed the point of human rights violations, and our Hispanic population is walking around with a target on its back. The Young Lords were an organization that fought for the equality of Latin Americans in the country, for which they have suffocated by the hands of white people able to buy them out of their homes. We see this in the Lux neighborhood of Lincoln Park, located right off the Brown Line CTA train, which is evidence of how we have erased the Latino influence in full from the city. The mostly white neighborhood that houses DePaul University is a demonstration of Latino oppression. The Young Lords, a group powerful enough to raise their voice at the feet of the violations that had put them so far behind, leaves us only to wonder what we have done to silence their noise to a whisper.
There's been trouble, and there's going to be more trouble. We're going to continue to have more trouble. You see, people are learning to struggle together. People are learning to fight together. And I don't think that's trouble, I think that's self-defense, I think we're defending ourselves, I think the trouble...
How we're going to respond to the killings of our people. We're not going to sit by and allow more Julios, right, and allow more Carmen Rodriguez abortion deaths. We have to begin to stand up as the people, the Puerto Rican people,